This wasn't just the failed werewolf transformation. This was something darker, more dangerous. "What's happening to me?" she gasped, terror flooding through her as her body continued to change in ways she didn't understand. Chapter 1. The Rejection That Changed Everything. The rain hammered against the forest floor as Seraphina collapsed to her knees, her body convulsing with pain that felt like liquid fire coursing through her veins. Above her, Kai's silver eyes held nothing but disgust as he stepped back from her writhing form. "You're not strong enough." His voice cut through the storm like a blade. "I won't waste my bite on someone so weak." The full moon blazed overhead, casting eerie shadows through the pine trees as Seraphina's human body fought against the transformation that would never come. Her fingernails scraped against the muddy earth, leaving desperate trails as she gasped for air that wouldn't fill her lungs. Thunder crashed as footsteps approached through the darkness. Seraphina's vision blurred, but she could make out a tall figure emerging from between the trees. His presence felt different, powerful, dangerous, yet somehow protective. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Her mate Kai had already turned his back, disappearing into the forest without a second glance. The stranger knelt beside her, and when she looked up, she saw eyes that glowed like molten gold in the moonlight. "I've got you," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "You're safe now." The pain intensified, and Seraphina realized with growing horror that something else was happening to her body. This wasn't just the failed werewolf transformation. This was something darker, more dangerous. Her skin began to shimmer with an otherworldly light, and when she looked at her hands, they appeared almost translucent. The golden-eyed stranger's expression shifted from concern to shock, then to something that looked almost like recognition. "What's happening to me?" she gasped, terror flooding through her as her body continued to change in ways she didn't understand. "You're not just human," the stranger said, his voice tight with urgency as he scooped her into his arms. "And you're definitely not a werewolf." His touch sent warmth spreading through her freezing body, and for the first time since Kai's rejection, the pain began to ebb. Seraphina could feel supernatural strength radiating from this mysterious man, but unlike Kai's cold power, this felt like a protective shield wrapping around her. As he carried her away from the place of her humiliation, she caught sight of his face in the moonlight, sharp jawline, dark hair plastered to his forehead by rain, and those incredible golden eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Lightning illuminated the forest one final time as they disappeared into the shadows, but Seraphina didn't see the figure watching them from behind the trees. Kai stood motionless, his silver eyes now filled not with disgust, but with a rage so pure it made the storm seem gentle by comparison. His hands clenched into fists as he watched the golden-eyed stranger carry away what he had just thrown aside. "She belongs to me," he whispered into the night, his voice promising violence. "And I always take back what's mine." Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. 3 years earlier, Seraphina had believed in fairy tales. She'd believed in mates and forever love when Kai first found her working the night shift at the diner outside Millbrook Falls. His silver eyes had promised her everything: protection, belonging, a family she'd never had after growing up in foster care. "You're different," he'd whispered during those early days, his fingers tracing her cheek with surprising gentleness. "Special. That's why the moon goddess brought you to me." Back then, his intensity had felt romantic, not terrifying. She'd moved into his cabin within a month, leaving behind her small apartment and the few friends she'd managed to make. The first red flag came 6 months into their relationship, when Kai forbade her from returning to work. "My woman doesn't serve coffee to strangers," he'd said, his voice carrying an edge that made her stomach clench. When she'd protested, needing the independence her job provided, he grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises. "Everything you need is here with me," he'd insisted, and foolishly, she'd believed him. The isolation began slowly. First, he disconnected the internet, Then he hid her car keys. Finally, he moved them deeper into the forest where cell phone signals couldn't reach. "It's just us against the world, baby," he'd murmur while holding her too tight, and she'd convinced herself it was love. The physical changes in Kai became more apparent as the months passed. Sometimes she'd catch glimpses of something inhuman in his reflection, eyes that glowed silver in darkness, canine teeth that seemed too sharp, muscles that rippled with unnatural strength. When she'd ask about these moments, he'd laugh and tell her she was imagining things. "Stress can make people see crazy stuff," he'd say, but his eyes would narrow in a way that warned her not to push. The scratches he'd come home with after his mysterious nighttime disappearances, the raw meat he'd devour with his bare hands, the way he'd sniff the air like he was tracking something, she'd forced herself to ignore all of it. By the third year, Seraphina had become a ghost of herself. Kai controlled everything: what she ate, when she slept, who she could speak to during their rare trips to town. He'd convinced her that she was weak, broken, unworthy of love from anyone else. "No one would want damaged goods like you," he'd say during his cruel moments, usually after he'd been drinking. The worst part was how he'd alternate between cruelty and tenderness, keeping her constantly off balance. He'd hurt her, then hold her while she cried, promising it would never happen again. "I only get angry because I love you so much," he'd whisper into her hair, and she'd cling to those words like a lifeline. The night of her transformation attempt, Kai had finally revealed his true nature to her. "I'm a werewolf," he'd announced casually, as if discussing the weather. "And if you're worthy, if you're strong enough to handle it, I'll make you one too." The bite, he'd explained, would either transform her into his eternal mate or kill her outright. "Weak humans don't survive," he'd said, his silver eyes gleaming with anticipation. As they'd walked into the forest under the full moon, Seraphina had felt a terror deeper than anything she'd experienced in their 3 years together. Something in his expression told her that he was hoping she wouldn't survive, that this was his way of finally being rid of the burden she'd become. The stranger's penthouse overlooked the city like a castle in the clouds, all floor-to-ceiling windows and sleek modern furniture that seemed to cost more than Seraphina had ever seen in her life. "My name is Damon," he told her during the drive, his hands steady on the steering wheel of his midnight black car that purred like a living thing. "And you're going to stay with me until we figure out what you are." Now, wrapped in the softest blanket she'd ever felt, she watched him move through his space with the fluid grace of a predator. Everything about him spoke of power and wealth, from his perfectly tailored clothes to the way he commanded respect from the doorman who'd greeted them with a respectful bow. "I don't understand what happened back there," Seraphina whispered, her voice still hoarse from screaming. The strange translucent shimmer had faded from her skin, but she could still feel something different humming beneath the surface, like electricity waiting to be unleashed. Damon handed her a cup of tea that smelled like honey and herbs, his golden eyes never leaving her face. "Your body rejected the werewolf bite," he explained, settling into the chair across from her. "But it didn't reject it because you're weak. It rejected it because you're something else entirely." The certainty in his voice both comforted and terrified her. How could he know more about her own body than she did? As the night wore on, Damon told her stories that sounded like myths. He spoke of ancient bloodlines, of creatures that existed in the spaces between human and supernatural, of powers that lay dormant until awakened by trauma or transformation attempts. "Hybrids are rare," he said, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. "Part human, part something that predates werewolves by thousands of years. Your body knew what Kai was trying to do, and it fought back." He showed her books filled with illustrations of beings that looked like angels crossed with warriors, their skin glowing with inner light. "These are your ancestors," he said softly. And they were magnificent. The exhaustion finally caught up with her as dawn painted the sky pink and gold. Damon led her to a guest room that was larger than the entire cabin she'd shared with Kai, complete with a private bathroom and a bed that felt like sleeping on a cloud. "Rest," he commanded gently, and something in his voice made her eyelids heavy despite her racing thoughts. "You're safe here, Seraphina. I give you my word." As she drifted off to sleep, She felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years' peace. The constant tension that had lived in her shoulders, the hypervigilance that had kept her walking on eggshells, all of it melted away under the weight of genuine safety. But even in sleep, she dreamed of silver eyes and cruel smiles. In her nightmares, Kai hunted through the forest, following her scent like a bloodhound. She could hear his voice calling her name, promising forgiveness if she'd just come home. "You can't hide from me forever, baby," his voice echoed through her dreams. "I know what you are now, and I know exactly how to find you." She woke with a gasp as the sun set outside her window, her heart pounding with the absolute certainty that Kai wasn't going to let her go. He'd tasted her blood, felt her power, and now he wanted what he'd tried to destroy. Chapter 2: Revelations and Recognition. Seraphina found Damon on his terrace, gazing out at the city lights that twinkled like earthbound stars. He'd changed into casual clothes, dark jeans, and a black sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, but even relaxed, he radiated an authority that made her pulse quicken. "Tell me about your parents," he said without turning around, somehow sensing her presence. She joined him at the railing, acutely aware of the heat radiating from his body despite the cool evening air. "I never knew them," she admitted. "The state found me on the steps of St. Catherine's when I was 3 days old. No note, no identification, just a baby in a white blanket." She'd always wondered about that detail. Why white? Why so pristine it seemed to glow in certain light? "White is the color of celestial beings," Damon said, finally turning to face her. His golden eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul, and she felt exposed in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. In the old stories, they wrapped their children in consecrated cloth before sending them into the human world for protection. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, before touching her cheek with fingers that were surprisingly gentle. "Your skin is warmer than it should be," he murmured, almost to himself. "And when you're emotional, there's a light that seems to come from within. I've only seen that in one other bloodline." The reverence in his voice made her skin tingle where he touched her. The conversation was interrupted by his phone buzzing with what sounded like an urgent message. Damon's expression darkened as he read, his jaw clenching in a way that made him look dangerous. "What is it?" Seraphina asked, though part of her already knew. "Kai's been asking questions around town," Damon said, his voice carrying a growl that seemed to vibrate through his chest. "He's telling people you were stolen from him, that you belong to his pack." The possessive way Damon's eyes flashed told her that this news affected him on a personal level. "You don't belong to anyone," he said firmly, his hands curling into fists. "And I'll make sure he understands that." "You don't understand," Seraphina said, wrapping her arms around herself as memories of Kai's obsessive nature flooded back. "He doesn't just think I belong to him, he thinks I'm his property. 3 years of telling me no one else would want me, that I'm too damaged, too weak." Her voice broke, and suddenly Damon was there, pulling her against his chest with a gentleness that made her want to cry. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rumbling through his chest where her cheek rested. "You are not weak. You are not damaged. You are extraordinary, and any man who can't see that is a fool." The conviction in his words made something crack open inside her chest, letting in light she hadn't felt in years. As they stood together on the terrace, Seraphina became aware of subtle changes in Damon's body. His heartbeat was too slow, too powerful. His skin was too warm, and when she breathed in, his scent was like pine forests and wild storms. "What are you?" she whispered against his chest, and she felt him tense. "I'm the alpha of the Shadow Moon Pack," he said quietly. "One of the largest werewolf packs on the East Coast." The revelation should have terrified her, but instead, she felt a strange sense of rightness. "And right now," he continued, his arms tightening around her protectively, "you're under my protection. Which means if Kai wants to get to you, he'll have to go through me first." The promise in his voice was absolute, backed by a power that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential violence. 3 days later, the first sign of Kai's escalation arrived in the form of dead roses outside Damon's building. Seraphina stared at the withered black petals scattered across the pristine marble lobby, her blood turning to ice as she recognized the cruel symbolism. "He used to bring me roses when he was sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Red ones when he wanted forgiveness, white ones when he was trying to be romantic." The security guard was already sweeping them up, but the message was clear. Kai knew exactly where she was. Damon appeared beside her, his presence immediately calming the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "He's trying to scare you," he said, his golden eyes scanning the lobby with predatory intensity. It's a classic intimidation tactic. But it was working. That night, Seraphina couldn't sleep, jumping at every shadow and sound. She found herself pacing Damon's living room at 3 a.m, her nerves stretched to the breaking point. "He's out there somewhere," she said when Damon emerged from his bedroom, his hair tousled and his chest bare. The sight of him should have been distracting, but her fear was too overwhelming. Watching, waiting, planning his next move. Damon crossed her in 3 long strides, his hands settling on her shoulders with gentle firmness. "Look at me," he commanded, and when she met his eyes, they were glowing with that supernatural gold. "He will not touch you. I promise you that." The alpha authority in his voice was absolute, and despite her terror, she found herself believing him. The next morning brought a new horror. Photos slipped under her door showing her and Damon together on his terrace, taken with a telephoto lens from some impossible distance. In each image, Kai had drawn red circles around Damon's hands wherever they touched her, with violent threats scrawled in the margins. "Mine" was written over and over in increasingly erratic handwriting. "She belongs to me." Damon's reaction was swift and terrifying. His eyes blazed gold, his hands shifted into claws, and for a moment, Seraphina caught a glimpse of the wolf. Beneath his human facade, "He's declared war," Damon growled, his voice distorting with barely contained rage. "Then he'll get one." That afternoon, Damon made calls that sent chills down Seraphina's spine. She could hear fragments of conversation, territory disputes, pack law, someone named Marcus who owed Damon a favor. "I need surveillance on a rogue named Kai Morrison," she heard him say. "Silver eyes, brown hair, operates alone. Consider him hostile." The clinical way he discussed tracking another person should have frightened her, but instead, she felt protected for the first time in years. When he found her listening, he didn't apologize for his methods. "This is how we handle threats to the pack," he explained simply. "And whether you realize it or not, you're pack now." The evening brought an unexpected visitor, a woman with midnight black hair and eyes like cut emeralds who introduced herself as Luna, Damon's second-in-command. "I came to meet the woman who has our alpha so twisted up," she said with a knowing smile that made Seraphina blush. But Luna's expression grew serious as she examined the threatening photos. "This isn't normal werewolf behavior," she observed, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to violence. "Most rogues move on when they encounter a stronger alpha." This level of obsession. She exchanged a meaningful look with Damon. He's not going to stop until he either gets her back or destroys her. The cold certainty in Luna's voice made Seraphina's blood freeze, but it also steeled her resolve. She was tired of being afraid, tired of being hunted. If Kai wanted a fight, maybe it was time to give him one. The transformation began during her sleep, triggered by nightmares of silver eyes and cruel hands. Seraphina woke to find her skin glowing with soft white light, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat like she'd swallowed moonbeams. Her reflection in the mirror showed eyes that had shifted from brown to silver white, and when she touched the glass, it cracked under her fingertips. "Damon," she called out, her voice carrying harmonics that made the windows vibrate. He appeared in her doorway within seconds, but instead of fear, his expression held wonder and something that looked almost like hunger. "It's beginning," he breathed, stepping closer despite the energy crackling around her like visible electricity. "What's happening to me?" Seraphina gasped as power surged through her veins like liquid starlight. Every emotion she'd suppressed for 3 years seemed to be burning its way to the surface: rage at Kai's abuse, grief for the woman she'd been before him, and underneath it all, a growing awareness of her own strength. Damon reached for her, And when their skin connected, the light intensified, wrapping around them both. "You're awakening," he said, his voice filled with reverence. "Your hybrid nature is finally emerging, probably triggered by the stress and the proximity to werewolf energy." His touch anchored her, keeping the power from spinning completely out of control. The ceiling lights exploded in showers of sparks as her emotions peaked, but Damon didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled her closer, his own supernatural nature rising to meet hers. His eyes blazed gold, his skin rippled with barely contained wolf energy, and together they created a light show that would have been visible from space. "This is why Kai's bite didn't work," Damon explained, his voice tight with concentration as he helped her channel the power. "Your body was already claimed by something far older and stronger than werewolf magic." The way he said it made her feel precious instead of cursed, powerful instead of broken. But with the awakening came vulnerability. Seraphina could suddenly sense things she'd never noticed before. The supernatural signatures of everyone in the building, the pack bonds that connected Damon to his wolves across the city, and most terrifyingly, a familiar presence stalking the perimeter like a caged predator. "He's here," she whispered, the certainty hitting her like a physical blow. "Kai's in the building." Damon's expression shifted instantly from wonder to lethal protectiveness, his canine teeth extending as his wolf rose to the surface. "How many floors down?" he asked, already moving toward his weapons cabinet. "6, she said, amazed by her newfound awareness. "And he's not alone." The lights in the penthouse dimmed as Seraphina unconsciously drew energy from the electrical systems, her hybrid nature preparing for battle. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see storm clouds gathering despite the clear weather forecast, responding to her emotional state. "I won't hide anymore," she said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "If he wants me, he can face what I've become." Damon turned to study her, taking in the way power rippled beneath her skin like liquid light, the way her newly silver eyes held no trace of the broken woman Kai had created. "Then we end this tonight," he agreed, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "But we do it together." The promise in his words was absolute. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. Chapter 3. Blood Calls to Blood. The elevator had been disabled, forcing Kai and his 3 rogue companions to take the stairs, exactly as Damon had planned. Seraphina watched from the security monitors as they climbed, her ex-mate's familiar form moving with predatory grace despite his human appearance. "He's changed," she murmured, noting the way the other rogues deferred to him, the casual violence in his movements. 3 years ago, he was cruel but human. Now... She trailed off as Kai looked directly into one of the cameras, his silver eyes holding a madness that made her stomach clench. But as she stared at those familiar features, something else stirred in her mind, a fragment of memory that felt ancient and urgent. For just a moment, she saw Kai's face overlaid with another image, a man in elaborate robes bowing before a throne, his eyes filled with reverence and fear as he gazed upon someone with golden eyes. "Now he's something else entirely," Damon finished grimly, checking the clip in his modified weapon that fired silver bullets. His voice carried an odd resonance that Seraphina had never noticed before, something that seemed to vibrate in her bones like a tuning fork. When she turned to look at him, preparing to ask about the strange memory fragment, her world tilted on its axis. Damon's golden eyes weren't just watching the monitors. They were watching her with an intensity that spoke of recognition, of knowledge held back, of secrets that ran deeper than mere attraction. "Damon," she whispered, her voice catching as another memory fragment surfaced, a child's laughter echoing through marble halls, 2 sets of golden eyes playing hide and seek among crystalline pillars. The hybrid power that had been growing stronger within her suddenly surged, but not in response to the approaching threat. It was responding to Damon's presence in a way that felt familiar, like a key finding its lock after centuries of searching. Her skin began to glow with that ethereal white light, but this time it didn't feel wild or uncontrolled. Instead, it felt like coming home. What aren't you telling me? She asked, taking a step closer to him despite the immediate danger they faced. The air between them shimmered with energy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with recognition on a cellular level. Why do I feel like I've known you my entire life? Damon's composure finally cracked, his carefully maintained mask slipping to reveal something vulnerable and desperate underneath. Because you have, he said quietly, his golden eyes never leaving her face. Seraphina, I've been searching for you for over 200 years. The words hit her like a physical blow, but before she could process them fully, another wave of memories crashed over her. She saw herself as a small child with hair like spun starlight and eyes that blazed gold, running through gardens that seemed to be made of living crystal. Beside her ran another child, taller and protective, his golden eyes identical to her own. They weren't playmates, they were siblings, and they were running from something terrible that filled the sky with shadow and screaming. 20 floors down, the first confrontation erupted in the stairwell, but the sounds of battle felt distant and unimportant compared to the revelation unfolding in the penthouse. Luna and 2 other pack members had positioned themselves strategically, but Kai moved through them like they were paper dolls. Seraphina watched in horror as her ex-mate's human facade melted away, revealing claws that extended from his fingertips and strength that sent a 200-pound werewolf flying through a concrete wall. But now she understood why his obsession had run so deep, why he'd sensed something special about her from the very beginning. He could smell the royal bloodline, she whispered, the knowledge flowing through her like water through a broken dam. That's why he never let me go. That's not normal werewolf transformation, Damon observed, his voice tight with concern as he watched Kai's display of enhanced abilities. He's been experimenting with something, enhancing himself. But even as he spoke, his attention kept returning to Seraphina, watching as recognition dawned in her eyes and ancient memories began to surface. The realization hit them both simultaneously. Kai hadn't spent 3 years pining for her. He'd spent them preparing for war against the last remnants of the hybrid royal line. He knows what we are, Damon said, the words carrying the weight of inevitability. He's known all along. The memories came faster now, flooding through Seraphina's consciousness like a dam bursting. She remembered the war that had torn their world apart, shadow creatures pouring through dimensional rifts, hybrid cities burning, their parents fighting desperately to save their children before the palace walls came crashing down. She remembered being separated from her brother in the chaos, remembered the terror of losing the only family she'd ever known. But most clearly, she remembered the promise he'd made as strange magic tore them apart. I'll find you, little star. No matter how long it takes, no matter how far you go, I'll find you. The pet name he'd used echoed in her mind, and suddenly Damon's careful protectiveness, his immediate willingness to shelter her, his inexplicable wealth and influence all made perfect sense. You knew, she said, not an accusation but a statement of fact. When you found me in the forest, you knew exactly who I was. Damon nodded slowly, his golden eyes reflecting centuries of pain and searching. Your soul calls to mine the way it always has, he admitted. Hybrid siblings are bonded on a level deeper than DNA, we're 2 halves of the same original power source. That's why being near me calms your abilities, why our energy signatures complement each other perfectly. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, his fingers traced her cheek with a reverence that had nothing to do with romantic love and everything to do with family reunion. That's why I couldn't leave you with him, why every instinct I possess screamed at me to protect you. The lights began flickering throughout the building as Seraphina's emotions spiked, but now she understood that her hybrid power was responding not just to the approaching threat, but to the overwhelming relief of finally finding her place in the world. I can feel him getting closer, she whispered, her skin beginning to glow with that ethereal white light. He's not just angry, he's obsessed. Completely consumed by the need to own me. But her voice carried a new strength, the authority of someone who had just remembered her true heritage. The broken woman Kai had created was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to remember what it meant to be supernatural royalty. But he's not facing a victim anymore, she continued, her silver-white eyes blazing with ancient power. "He's facing the last heir of the Crystal Throne." Damon moved to her side, his presence immediately amplifying rather than calming her power fluctuations. When their energy signatures merged, the very air around them began to shimmer with potential that made the building's infrastructure hum in harmony. "Obsession makes people dangerous," he said, "but it also makes them stupid. He's so focused on claiming you that he won't see the trap until it's too late." His golden eyes held absolute confidence, but Seraphina could sense something deeper now, not just worry for her safety, but the fierce protectiveness of an older brother who had already lost his sister once and would die before allowing it to happen again. "We faced this together, the way we should have faced the Shadow War centuries ago." The revelation recontextualized every interaction they'd shared since that night in the forest. The immediate trust hadn't been foolish, it had been recognition on a soul-deep level. The way her power responded to his presence wasn't romantic chemistry, but the restoration of a sibling bond that transcended death and reincarnation. Even her body's rejection of Kai's werewolf bite made sense now. Her hybrid royal blood had recognized the attempt to bind her to someone unworthy and had fought back with lethal force. "How many others survived?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the way Damon's expression darkened. "How many of our people are still out there?" "As far as I know, we're the only ones left," Damon replied, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of loneliness. "I've searched every corner of this world and several others. The Shadow War was meant to be a complete genocide. They wanted to eliminate our bloodline entirely." His hands clenched into fists as rage flickered behind his golden eyes. "But they failed because you survived. Because somehow, against all odds, I found you again." The emotion in his voice was raw and honest, the relief of a brother who had thought himself completely alone in the universe. "That's why the High Council is interested in you, why supernatural beings react so strongly to your presence. They can sense what you are, even if they don't consciously understand it." The penthouse door exploded inward in a shower of metal and wood, interrupting the emotional reunion with brutal efficiency. Kai stepped through the destruction like an avenging angel, but this wasn't the man who had controlled her for 3 years. This was something darker, more dangerous. His silver eyes had developed an unholy glow, his muscles rippled with unnatural strength, and when he smiled, his canine teeth had elongated into true fangs. "Hello, baby," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the windows rattle. "Did you miss me?" Behind him, his 3 companions spread out with military precision, but their eyes held a reverence that Seraphina now recognized. They weren't just following a rogue werewolf, they were serving someone they believed could claim a hybrid princess. But Kai's confident entrance faltered when he truly saw what awaited him. The energy radiating from Seraphina and Damon together was unlike anything he'd encountered during his enhancements. Where before there had been one confused hybrid struggling to understand her nature, now there stood 2 beings whose combined power made the air itself sing with harmonic resonance. "Impossible," he breathed, his enhanced senses finally able to read the truth he'd been too obsessed to see before. "You're not just hybrids, you're..." He trailed off as recognition dawned, his artificial enhancements allowing him to perceive the royal signatures that marked them as the last survivors of the Crystal Court. "The lost heirs. Both of you. You have 10 seconds to leave my territory," Damon said, his voice carrying not just the authority of an alpha addressing rogues, but the absolute command of hybrid royalty addressing a usurper. His own transformation began subtly, eyes blazing gold, muscles expanding, claws extending from fingertips that looked like they could shred steel. But more than physical changes, power flowed from him like a tangible force, the awakened authority of a crown prince who had finally found his missing sister. "Or I'll make sure you never threaten anyone again." The air itself seemed to vibrate with potential violence as 2 apex predators faced off in the ruins of the penthouse entrance. But this wasn't just territory dispute. This was the old nobility confronting those who would dare claim what didn't belong to them. Kai's obsessed gaze drank in every detail of Seraphina's transformation, but now his hunger carried a different quality, not just desire but desperate ambition. Look at you, he breathed, taking a step closer despite Damon's threatening posture. Even more beautiful than I imagined you could be. We're going to be magnificent together, baby. Once I kill him and make you mine forever. But his words carried new weight now, the promise of someone who believed that claiming a hybrid princess would elevate him beyond his artificial enhancements to something approaching godhood. You don't understand what you're throwing away, he continued, his voice growing more manic with each word. I've spent 3 years becoming worthy of you. I've taken power from vampires, stolen magic from witches, enhanced myself in ways that should have killed me, all to be strong enough to stand beside hybrid royalty. You were never worthy, Seraphina said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the building's structure resonate in response. Not because you weren't strong enough, but because you never understood what strength actually means. Her power flared, pure white light that revealed the true nature of everyone in the room, Kai's artificial enhancements looking like crude graphs over his original werewolf nature, his companion's loyalty tainted by magical compulsion, and most clearly, the golden thread of connection that linked her to Damon on a level deeper than conscious thought. You spent 3 years trying to become something you could never be, when what I needed was someone who would help me remember what I already was. The confrontation shifted as Seraphina stepped forward, no longer hiding behind Damon's protection, but standing beside him as an equal. The sibling bond between them created a feedback loop of power that transformed the destroyed penthouse into something approaching a throne room, their combined energy making the very air shimmer with royal authority. I remember now, she said, her silver-white eyes fixed on Kai with the absolute judgment of someone who had reclaimed her birthright. I remember the crystal courts, the shadow war, and most importantly, I remember what happened to those who tried to claim power that was never meant for them. Her smile was beautiful and terrible, the expression of a princess who had finally remembered how to wield a crown. Kai's enhanced form began to tremble, not with fear but with the strain of maintaining his artificial improvements in the face of such pure hybrid power. You can't deny what we had, he said desperately, his voice cracking as his carefully constructed persona began to crumble. 3 years, Seraphina. 3 years of building something together. But even as he spoke, his companions were backing away, their magically compelled loyalty beginning to waver as they faced the reality of what they'd been sent to capture. This wasn't a broken human woman they could intimidate. This was supernatural nobility whose very presence made their enhanced abilities feel like children's toys. What we had, Seraphina replied, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth, was you controlling someone who had forgotten her own power. But I'm not that person anymore. The white light emanating from her skin intensified, and for a moment, the penthouse was transformed into something that looked like a palace made of starlight and crystal. I am Seraphina of the Crystal Court, last daughter of the Lunar Crown, and you will never touch me again. The declaration resonated through multiple dimensions, a statement of identity that made reality itself sit up and take notice. Somewhere in the supernatural world, ancient powers stirred in response to the return of the lost princess. Beside her, Damon's own power rose to match hers, his golden eyes blazing with the authority of a crown prince who had spent centuries preparing for this moment. And I am Damon of the Crystal Court, last son of the Solar Crown, guardian of the lunar air, and the one who will end your pathetic existence if you take another step toward my sister. The word sister rang through the air like a bell, finally giving name to the bond that had defined their relationship from the moment they met. Not romance, not mere attraction, but the reunion of the last 2 members of a royal line that had once ruled over all supernatural beings. The truth hung in the air between them like a physical presence, rewriting everything that had come before and setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine not just their survival, but the future of their entire bloodline. As Kai's face contorted with rage and desperate hunger, and his companions prepared for what they now realized was not a simple kidnapping, but an assault on supernatural royalty itself, the lost heirs of the Crystal Court stood ready to reclaim their heritage. Together, the way they were always meant to be. Kai's first attack came within human speed, but Damon was ready. The two supernatural beings collided with a force that shattered every remaining window in the penthouse, their claws and fangs creating sparks as they clashed in a display of raw supernatural power that made the air itself scream. Seraphina watched in terror and fascination as her brother revealed his true nature. Damon's wolf was massive, his golden fur seeming to absorb and reflect light like liquid metal, his power absolute and beautiful in its royal heritage. But Kai had become something else entirely, his partially shifted form showing signs of multiple supernatural influences grafted together in ways that should have killed him. Dark veins pulsed beneath his skin where vampire blood had been injected, which sigils carved into his flesh glowed with stolen magic, and his werewolf nature had been twisted into something unrecognizable. "What did you do to yourself?" Damon snarled between strikes, his voice distorted by his partial transformation, but carrying the horrified authority of someone witnessing abomination. "I made myself worthy of her," Kai replied, his claws raking across Damon's ribs and drawing golden blood that sparkled with royal hybrid essence. "Werewolf, vampire, witch magic, I took power from anyone who had it to give." But as he spoke, Seraphina caught something in his voice that chilled her to the bone, not the desperate obsession of a lover, but the clinical precision of someone reciting a mission statement. The revelation hit her like a physical blow as memories began to shift and recontextualize. The way he'd found her at the diner hadn't been chance, he'd been waiting for her shift to end, studying her patterns. The immediate intensity of his pursuit hadn't been love at first sight, it had been targeted acquisition. While she'd been learning to live without him after their separation, Kai had been transforming himself into a monster capable of claiming her hybrid nature, but not out of love. Out of duty to something far more sinister. "You turned yourself into an abomination," she said, her voice carrying power that made both fighters pause mid-strike. The words resonated with hybrid authority, but beneath them lay a growing horror as puzzle pieces began clicking into place. "You destroyed yourself trying to own me." Her skin blazed with white light as her emotions peaked, the hybrid power flowing through her like molten starlight, but now it carried undertones of betrayal so deep they made her very soul ache. Every gentle moment, every whispered endearment, every time he'd held her while she cried, all of it had been calculated manipulation designed to keep her compliant and broken. The man she'd thought had loved her, even obsessively, had never loved her at all. He'd been playing a role, following orders, executing a long-term mission with the patience of a professional killer. The other rogues chose that moment to attack, but they had gravely underestimated what they were facing. Seraphina's power erupted outward in a wave of pure energy that sent them flying across the destroyed penthouse, their bodies crashing through walls and furniture with bone-crushing force. Where her light touched them, their artificial enhancements began to burn away like paper in fire, revealing the corrupted werewolves underneath. But as the purifying energy stripped away their stolen abilities, it revealed something else, matching tattoos on their necks, intricate symbols that pulsed with fading magic. "She's not just a hybrid," one of them gasped, his voice filled with terror as he stared at the marks being burned from his skin. "She's a purifier. She can strip away unnatural power." But his words carried a different weight now, spoken not with surprise, but with the recognition of someone whose cover had just been blown. "Council executors," Damon breathed, his golden eyes widening as he recognized the symbols before they were completely destroyed by Seraphina's light. "You're all council executors." The realization changed everything about the confrontation. This wasn't a rogue werewolf's obsession gone wrong. This was a sanctioned mission by the supernatural world's governing body. The High Council had been watching Seraphina, had sent their most skilled agents to monitor and control her, and when that control had started to slip, they'd moved to direct action. "How long?" he demanded, his voice carrying the dangerous authority of hybrid royalty addressing those who had dared to hunt his sister. "How long have you been watching her?" Kai's enhanced form trembled, not with fear but with the strain of maintaining his artificial improvements while his true mission was being exposed. The purifying light emanating from Seraphina was burning away more than just his physical enhancements. It was stripping away the magical compulsions that had helped him maintain his cover for 3 years. Since she was 18, he admitted, his voice cracking as layers of deception fell away like burning skin. The council identified her the moment she aged out of foster care. They knew what she was, knew her power would eventually awaken, and they sent me to. He trailed off as Seraphina's horrified expression registered, the weight of his betrayal finally hitting him with full force. They sent me to monitor her, to keep her contained until they decided whether she was a threat that needed to be eliminated. The words hung in the air like poison gas, each revelation more devastating than the last. Seraphina felt her world reshaping itself around this new reality. Every moment of their relationship had been a lie, every gesture of affection calculated to keep her docile and isolated. The cabin in the woods, she whispered, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Moving me away from civilization, cutting off my internet, hiding my car keys, you weren't being possessive. You were keeping me isolated so I couldn't accidentally reveal my nature to anyone else. Her voice grew stronger as rage began to overtake shock. The psychological abuse, making me think I was worthless, that no one else would want me, that was part of the mission too, wasn't it? Keep me broken so my powers wouldn't fully manifest. It was supposed to be simple, Kai said, his artificial enhancements beginning to smoke as Seraphina's purifying light intensified. Monitor the target, assess threat level, report back to the council for final judgment. But somewhere along the way, his voice broke as the magical compulsions that had helped him maintain emotional distance finally burned away completely. Somewhere along the way, the act became real. I started to actually feel what I was supposed to be pretending to feel. The obsession, the need to possess you, that wasn't part of the mission. That was me breaking my conditioning and becoming something the council never intended to create. You see now, Damon said, his golden eyes never leaving Kai's face as he positioned himself protectively beside Seraphina rather than in front of her. The shift was subtle, but significant, brother standing with sister rather than guardian protecting ward. She was never meant to be yours. Her power is the antithesis of everything you've made yourself into. But the revelation that Kai was a council executor changed the implications entirely. This wasn't just about one rogue's obsession. This was about the supernatural world's governing body deciding that the return of hybrid royalty posed too great a threat to be allowed. The council fears what we represent, he continued, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of exile. They've spent generations consolidating power, and our bloodline threatens that control. But instead of deterring him, the revelation seemed to inflame Kai's genuine obsession even further. The fake love had become real madness, and now that his cover was blown, he had nothing left to lose. Then I'll drain her dry, he snarled, his hybrid form growing more monstrous by the moment as the last of his artificial restraints burned away. If I can't have her power willingly, I'll take it by force. The council can have what's left when I'm finished. The threat hung in the air like acid, and Seraphina felt something inside her shift, not fear this time, but rage so pure it made her previous anger seem like a candle compared to a forest fire. The broken woman he'd helped create was gone forever, replaced by someone who finally understood the true scope of the betrayal she'd endured. As Seraphina's power continued to strip away his enhancements, more truth was revealed. Carved into Kai's chest, previously hidden beneath layers of magical concealment, was an elaborate tattoo that made Damon curse in a language that predated modern civilization. The symbol was unmistakable, a stylized eye surrounded by chains, the mark of a council executor authorized to monitor, contain, and eliminate threats to supernatural order. How many others are there? Seraphina demanded, her voice carrying harmonics that made reality itself seem to bend around her words. How many other agents does the council have watching people like me? The implications were staggering. If they'd been monitoring her since she aged out of foster care, how many other potential hybrids were being watched, controlled, or eliminated? Dozens, Kai admitted, his voice growing weaker as his stolen powers continued to burn away under her purifying light. The council maintains extensive surveillance networks. Anyone who shows signs of unusual heritage, anyone whose bloodline might pose a threat, we watch them all. His silver eyes, now dull and lifeless as his vampire enhancements failed, met hers with something that might have been genuine remorse. But you were special. The moment they identified your royal bloodline, they knew you couldn't be allowed to awaken fully. That's why they sent their best executor, someone who could get close enough to monitor you indefinitely, maybe even convince you that a normal human life was all you wanted. The temperature in the room dropped as Seraphina's power shifted from defensive to offensive, but now it carried the controlled fury of someone who had finally seen the true scope of her enemies. Every light bulb in the building exploded simultaneously as she drew energy from the electrical grid, her hybrid nature finally fully awakening to its royal heritage. But this wasn't the wild, uncontrolled surge of power she'd experienced before. This was the measured, devastating authority of a princess who had just discovered her kingdom had been stolen from her. "You want my power?" she asked, her voice carrying harmonics that made the building's foundation resonate in response. "Then come and take it. But know that you're not facing the broken woman you helped create, you're facing the last heir of the crystal throne, and I remember now what that means." When she looked at Kai, her silver-white eyes held no trace of the woman who had once believed his lies of love. This was something ancient and terrible and absolutely beautiful, radiating the kind of power that had once ruled over all supernatural beings. For the first time in their relationship, their entire fake relationship, Kai took a step backward, his enhanced senses finally able to perceive what he'd been sent to monitor and destroy. "Seraphina," he whispered, and there was actual fear in his voice as he realized that his mission had just become impossible. "What have you become?" But he already knew the answer, had always known it on some level. She had become what the council feared most, a hybrid royal who remembered her heritage and had the power to reclaim it. "I've become what I always was," she replied, her skin blazing with light that seemed to come from another dimension entirely. "I've just stopped pretending to be less than that to make other people comfortable." Around her, the destroyed penthouse began to transform, the debris rearranging itself into something that looked suspiciously like a throne room. The question is, what happens to a council executor who has failed his mission so completely that he's become the very thing he was sent to prevent? Her smile was beautiful and terrifying, the expression of someone who had just realized that she held absolute power over the person who had spent 3 years destroying her sense of self-worth. The revelation recontextualized everything, not just their relationship, but her entire adult life. Every moment of isolation, every instance of psychological manipulation, every time she'd been made to feel worthless and unwanted, it had all been a carefully orchestrated campaign to keep her from discovering her true nature. But the council's plan had a fatal flaw. They'd sent someone capable of genuine emotion to execute a mission that required absolute detachment. Kai's real obsession had corrupted his false love, creating a monster that threatened both their objectives and her safety. "The council is going to be very disappointed in you," she observed, her voice carrying the casual authority of someone discussing the weather. "I wonder what they do to executors who go rogue?" As the last of his artificial enhancements burned away, leaving behind only a broken man whose real emotions had finally overwhelmed his training, Kai fell to his knees before the woman he'd been sent to destroy. The executor's mark on his chest was gone, burned away by purifying light, but the weight of his failures remained. "They'll send others," he gasped, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. "This was just the first attempt. When I don't report back, when they realize you've awakened fully." He looked up at her with eyes that held no trace of his former madness, only the hollow recognition of someone who had just realized the scope of his betrayal. "They'll send an army next time." "Let them come," Seraphina said, her voice carrying the absolute confidence of someone who had just reclaimed a birthright that predated the council's authority by millennia. "I spent 3 years believing I was powerless because you convinced me I was. But I'm not the broken woman you reported on anymore. I'm the heir to a throne that your council stole, and I think it's time I took it back." The promise in her words was absolute, backed by power that made the air itself sing with harmonic resonance. Beside her, Damon's own royal heritage responded to hers, their combined authority creating a feedback loop that announced to every supernatural being within 100 miles that the lost heirs of the Crystal Court had returned. The truth hung between them like a living thing, reshaping not just their understanding of the past, but their vision of the future. The council had made a critical error in their calculation. They'd tried to control someone whose bloodline had once ruled over them, and in doing so, they'd awakened something far more dangerous than a confused hybrid. They'd awakened a princess who remembered her heritage and had both the power and the motivation to reclaim what had been stolen from her people. As Kai knelt before her, stripped of his enhancements and his mission both failed and fulfilled in the worst possible way, Seraphina of the Crystal Court began to plan the restoration of a kingdom that had been lost for centuries. Chapter 4. The Battle for Freedom. Seraphina's answer came not in words, but in pure, devastating power. Light erupted from her skin like a miniature sun, filling the destroyed penthouse with radiance that burned away shadows and illusions alike. Kai's artificially enhanced form began to smoke where her light touched him, his stolen powers unraveling under the purifying force of her hybrid nature. "This is what I was always meant to be," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally claimed their birthright. "And you were never meant to cage me." The very air around her shimmered with energy that made breathing feel like swallowing starlight. Damon used Kai's distraction to his advantage, his massive wolf form launching into an attack that sent both of them crashing through the reinforced wall into the adjacent apartment. The sound of their battle echoed through the building like thunder, punctuated by Kai's increasingly desperate roars of rage. "She belongs to me," he screamed, his voice distorting as his stolen powers fought against Seraphina's purifying light. "I made her. I shaped her. Everything she is exists because of me." But even as he spoke, his hybrid form was beginning to collapse, the various supernatural enhancements burning away under the sustained assault of her energy. "You made me afraid," Seraphina called out, following the fighters through the destroyed wall with steps that left glowing footprints in the debris. "You made me small and broken and convinced I was worthless." With each word, her power intensified, stripping away another layer of Kai's artificial strength. "But you never made me weak. That strength was always mine, I just forgot how to use it." Around her, the very structure of the building began to respond to her hybrid nature, metal gleaming brighter, concrete becoming smoother, as if her presence was perfecting everything it touched. The final confrontation came when Kai, stripped of most of his stolen powers, but still possessing the desperate strength of obsession, made one last attempt to claim her. He burst through Damon's defenses with a suicidal charge, his claws extended towards Seraphina's throat. But instead of the broken woman he'd controlled for 3 years, he found himself facing someone who had finally remembered what she was capable of. Her hand caught his wrist with casual ease, her grip burning through his remaining enhancements like acid through paper. "I forgive you," she said quietly, and those 3 words carried more power than any curse. "But I will never belong to you again." The purification was complete and devastating. Kai's stolen powers burned away entirely, leaving behind a broken man whose obsession had consumed everything that had once made him human. He collapsed to his knees, his silver eyes now dull and lifeless, his supernatural strength reduced to that of an ordinary human. "Please," he whispered, reaching for her with hands that trembled with exhaustion. "I can't live without you." But Seraphina was already turning away, her attention focused on Damon, who was watching her with an expression of wonder and something deeper. "Then learn," she said without looking back. "The way I had to learn to live without the person I used to be." As sirens wailed in the distance and pack members flooded into the building, Kai's reign of terror finally came to an end. Chapter 5. The Queen's Return. 6 months later, Seraphina stood in the garden of Damon's country estate, her hybrid nature now fully integrated and controlled. The terror and helplessness that had defined her for 3 years had been replaced by confidence and purpose, her relationship with her brother deepening into something that felt both protective and empowering. The sibling bond they shared had healed wounds in both their souls that centuries of searching had left raw and bleeding. "You're glowing again," he observed, moving to stand beside her as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. His presence no longer felt like romantic tension, but like the other half of her soul finally returned to wholeness. "It happens when I'm at peace," she replied, feeling the contentment of someone who had finally found her true family. "I'm still getting used to emotions that heal instead of hurt." The pack had accepted her with surprising ease, though she was beginning to understand that their immediate loyalty wasn't just about her purifying abilities, it was something deeper, more instinctive. Even Luna, who had initially been suspicious of any woman who could command Damon's attention, had become fiercely protective once she understood the sibling bond. "You have the bearing of someone born to rule," Luna had observed during one of their training sessions. "It's not just confidence. It's something in your very DNA that makes others want to follow you." The comment had felt like casual observation at the time, but lately, Seraphina had begun to notice the way supernatural beings reacted to her presence. Not just respect, but something approaching reverence, as if her very existence triggered memories they couldn't quite access. The changes in herself went beyond mere power control. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of memories that didn't belong to her current life, vast cities made of crystal and starlight, beings of pure energy bowing before a throne that seemed to be carved from condensed moonbeams, and most disturbing of all, a war that had torn the very fabric between dimensions. "I've been having dreams," she'd confessed to Damon just last week. "Not dreams exactly, memories of a life I never lived, a world I've never seen." His golden eyes had grown troubled when she described the crystal cities and the throne room that felt more familiar than any place she'd actually been. "Those aren't dreams," he'd said quietly. "Those are echoes." The question is, echoes of what? The answer had begun to reveal itself in subtle ways. Ancient texts that Luna brought from the Pax library would glow faintly when Seraphina touched them, as if responding to some inner resonance. Supernatural beings from other territories would make pilgrimages to meet her, claiming they'd felt drawn by dreams they couldn't explain. Most telling of all, the very landscape around Damon's estate had begun to change. Plants grew more vibrant in her presence, the air itself seemed cleaner and more energized, and on particularly emotional nights, the northern lights would appear despite their southern location. "It's like reality is reshaping itself around you," Damon had observed with growing concern. "That level of environmental influence. I've only read about it in the oldest legends." Kai remained confined to a human psychiatric facility, his supernatural abilities permanently stripped away by her purifying light during their confrontation. But even powerless and broken, his obsession persisted in ways that troubled the facility's doctors. "He speaks of you as if you're a deity," Dr. Martinez had reported during their monthly update call. "Not just a former lover, but something he refers to as the Eternal Queen. He claims you've returned to reclaim a throne that was stolen, and that armies will rise to serve you whether you want them to or not." The doctors dismissed it as elaborate delusion, but Seraphina felt a chill every time she heard these reports. Kai's enhanced senses might have been destroyed, but something in his broken mind seemed to recognize truths that her conscious awareness couldn't quite grasp. Their peaceful evening was interrupted by Luna's urgent arrival, her usually composed expression tight with concern that bordered on fear. "We've got a problem," she announced without preamble, but instead of producing the expected letter from the High Council, she carried something far more disturbing, a collection of reports from packed territories across 3 continents. "It's not just the Council we need to worry about anymore," she said, spreading the documents across the garden table with trembling hands. "Something's awakening. Ancient things that have been dormant for millennia are stirring to life, and they're all focused on one thing." Her green eyes met Seraphina's with an intensity that made the hybrid royal skin begin to glow involuntarily. "They're all focused on you." The reports painted a picture that defied rational explanation. In Scotland, stone circles that had been dormant for thousands of years had begun emanating supernatural energy. In Egypt, hieroglyphs in sealed chambers were glowing with light that matched the radiance of Seraphina's hybrid power. Most disturbing of all, dimensional rifts, tears between worlds that hadn't been seen since the mythical Age of Shadows, were beginning to appear in remote locations around the globe. It started 6 months ago, Luna explained, her voice tight with worry. Right around the time you fully awakened to your royal heritage. Every major supernatural organization is reporting the same thing. Reality itself is responding to something, preparing for something, and all signs point to your emergence as the catalyst. Damon's expression darkened as he studied the reports, his golden eyes reflecting the kind of ancient knowledge that came from living through centuries of supernatural politics. These aren't random phenomena, he said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding. This is a summoning pattern. Something is using your awakening as a beacon, calling things from the spaces between worlds. He looked up at Seraphina with an expression that mixed protective love with growing dread. Sister, I think your return has announced something far more significant than we realized. These are the signs the old texts describe, the harbingers that appear when the Eternal Queen rises to reclaim her throne. The Eternal Queen, Seraphina repeated, the title resonating through her consciousness like a bell struck in a cathedral. As she spoke the words, memories that weren't quite memories began to surface with startling clarity. She saw herself, or someone who looked exactly like her, standing before armies of supernatural beings, her power holding back creatures made of living shadow and hunger. The memory felt real in a way that made her current life seem like the dream. I've heard that title before, she whispered, her skin beginning to blaze with white light as ancient knowledge fought to surface. Not in this life, but somewhere else. Someone else. The temperature in the garden dropped precipitously as Seraphina's power responded to the awakening memories. Around them, plants began to glow with the same ethereal light that emanated from her skin, and the very air shimmered with energy that made breathing feel like swallowing starlight. You're not just the last heir of the Crystal Court, Damon said, his voice filled with wonder and terror in equal measure. You're the reincarnation of the first hybrid queen, the original ruler who united all supernatural beings under one crown. That's why your power feels so ancient, why every supernatural being we encounter reacts to you like they're meeting their sovereign. The revelation hung between them like a physical presence, reshaping everything they thought they knew about her identity and her destiny. Luna stepped back involuntarily as waves of power rolled off Seraphina, her wolf instincts responding to the presence of something that transcended normal supernatural hierarchy. The legends say the Eternal Queen sacrificed herself to end the Shadow War, she whispered, her voice filled with awe. She used her own life force to seal the dimensional rifts and banish the Shadow Weavers back to the void between worlds. But the prophecies also say, she trailed off, unwilling to voice the implications of what they were discovering. They say she would return when the seals began to weaken, when the Shadow Weavers started trying to break through again. As if summoned by Luna's words, the reports on the table began to glow with the same light that surrounded Seraphina. New information appeared on the pages. Coordinates, dates, patterns that painted a terrifying picture of systematic dimensional incursion. The Shadow Weavers weren't just stirring, they were actively testing the barriers that had held them for millennia, probing for weaknesses, gathering strength for a renewed assault on reality itself. They know, Seraphina said, the knowledge flowing through her like poison. They can sense that I've returned, and they're preparing for war. The certainty in her voice came from memories that spanned lifetimes, knowledge encoded in her very soul about enemies that existed to devour supernatural power itself. The High Council's interests suddenly made perfect sense in this new context. They weren't just concerned about a powerful hybrid, they were terrified of the implications of the Eternal Queen's return. They think my awakening will trigger the Second Shadow War, Seraphina realized, ancient political knowledge surfacing alongside the memories of cosmic conflict. They're probably divided between those who want to study me and those who want to eliminate me before I can fulfill whatever destiny brought me back. The weight of expectation, of cosmic responsibility, settled on her shoulders like a mountain. She'd gone from victim to survivor to hybrid royal, only to discover that she was something far more significant and dangerous than any of them had imagined. As night fell over the estate with unnatural rapidity, the forest itself seemed to respond to the revelation of her true nature. Trees that had stood for centuries bent slightly in her direction, as if acknowledging the presence of their ancient sovereign. The northern lights appeared again despite their location, painting the sky in colors that had no names in modern languages. "This is just the beginning," Damon said, his protective instincts warring with the magnitude of what they were facing. "If you're truly the Eternal Queen reborn, then everything changes." The pack, the council, the entire supernatural world, none of it matters compared to what's coming. But even as they grappled with the implications of her true identity, Seraphina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. At the edge of the forest, shadows moved in ways that defied natural law, pooling and shifting like liquid darkness given predatory intelligence. The eyes watching from between the trees weren't silver like Kai's had been, or golden like Damon's. They were the color of absence itself, darker than the space between stars. "They're here," she whispered, ancient memories providing context for the terror that clawed at her consciousness. "The Shadow Weavers. They've found me." The beings that emerged from the darkness between dimensions were nightmares given form, creatures of pure hunger that existed in the spaces between thoughts, between heartbeats, between the moments when reality forgot to pay attention to itself. They had waited millennia for this moment, for the return of the one whose power could either seal them away forever or provide them with the key to devouring all of creation. "Eternal Queen," one of them spoke, its voice like the sound of hope dying in a child's throat. "We have waited so long for your return. Will you finish what you started, or will you finally join us in the Feast of Worlds?" Seraphina stood at the edge of the forest where her journey to self-discovery had begun, but now she faced darkness that predated civilization itself. Behind her, she could hear Damon rallying the pack, Luna coordinating defenses that would prove utterly inadequate against beings that could slip between dimensions. The weight of cosmic responsibility pressed down on her like the gravity of a collapsing star, but beneath the terror lay something else, a sense of rightness, of destiny finally fulfilled. "I know who I am now," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made reality itself resonate in response. "I am Seraphina of the Crystal Court, last daughter of the Lunar Crown, and the Eternal Queen returned to finish what she started." Her skin blazed with light that pushed back the encroaching darkness, but even as she stood defiant against the ancient enemy, she realized with crystal clarity that her story was just beginning. The Shadow Weavers pressed closer, their forms shifting between dimensions in ways that hurt to perceive directly, and Seraphina understood that the peaceful life she'd begun to build was already over. Whether she chose to embrace her destiny as the returned Eternal Queen or tried to flee from it, the Second Shadow War had already begun. The only question was whether this time, when the final battle came, there would be anything left of the world worth saving. As the first dimensional rift tore open above the estate, spilling creatures of living nightmare into the reality she'd fought so hard to claim as her own, Seraphina of the Crystal Court prepared to discover whether love, family, and hard-won peace could survive the return of an ancient evil that had already destroyed her once before. In the distance, more eyes opened in the darkness, not just shadow weavers, but the supernatural beings who remembered the old oaths, who had waited centuries for their queen to return and lead them into battle once more. The war for the very soul of existence was about to begin, and at its center stood a woman who had already died once to save the world, now reborn to face the same impossible choice that had defined her previous life. The only difference was that this time, she wouldn't face it alone.